Hey, so this video lecture is going to cover Tom Stoppard's Arcadia, and this is a full-length play, so there's going to be a lot of stuff that I don't really get the opportunity to talk about with this, particularly since Stoppard is one of my favorite playwrights. He's one of the best postmodernist playwrights working today. I've read a bunch of his plays, and he's a fantastic playwright. And actually, the first scholarly paper I have accepted for publication is about this play, Arcadia, and his other play, Travesties. So Stoppard is a postmodernist, and he is, and we get this in Arcadia. So that he's very interested in experimental sciences, so things like chaos theory, quantum mechanics, the laws of thermodynamics. These things inform Stoppard's works. Arcadia, Hapgood, things like this, plays like these. He's also interested in what we'd call postmodern historiography. Historiography being basically the science of how history is constructed, or the science of how history is narrated. So that's actually sort of what my paper on Arcadia and Travesties is about, is the way that Stoppard uses historiography and the uncertainty of historiography to sort of try and undo meta-narratives in this very postmodern way. So Arcadia is structured rather like a classical comedy, or a comedy of manners kind of approach, somewhat like The Importance of Being Earnest. But we've got all of these themes, and so structurally one of the biggest themes in this play is the way that contemporary research, contemporary archival work, contemporary historical investigation links with sort of actual experience of the past. Bernard, Valentine, and Hannah are all seeking some kind of historical truth. And what's really interesting, so this is complicated, and this is what I wrote my paper about, so I'm trying to explain this simply and directly. So the stage is set in the Coverley house in one room. The stage is the same for both 1809 and 1993. So both the Romantic era, again, Byron going back to the stuff we started this semester with, and contemporary for Stoppard, early 90s. The stage is the set. The house is the same, the furniture is the same, the setup is the same, the characters are different, and the modern characters are attempting to figure out what was going on at the time of the 1809 scenes. What's really interesting here is that, so normally we think, the way that we think of history working is that the people here in 1993 are investigating what was going on in 1809, right? This is the sort of standard way of thinking about history. What's really fascinating in Arcadia is the way that the people in 1993 come up with ideas, and then 1809 reflects those. So one critic wrote that materials from the future, materials from 1993, were being volleyed back into the past. So, for instance, there's this and I don't think I'm going to be able to find the page immediately, but there's the point at which Bernard says, if only there were some sort of Platonic letter that explained everything, a letter from Byron, who, of course, Bernard is investigating his sort of role in 1809 in this house. So Bernard says, if only there was a letter that explained everything, that would just end the whole debate. And then in the scene immediately following this, Septimus burns unread a letter from Byron, which we can presume was the letter explaining everything. So this is probably the best or most sort of dramatic example of a time when 1993 contemporary historians posit something and the past reacts to it. So this is a component of the postmodern historiography here, where Stoppard is undoing the narratives of history, the meta-narratives of history. And of course the meta-narrative of history is that we can chronicle things that have happened in the past. And instead what we're getting here is a sense that as the past is remembered from the present, the past reconstructs itself or reconfigures itself. So part of this is a concern with historiography. The other part of this is a concern of Stoppard's with chaos theory. And so I'm not a science person. I don't know that much about chaos theory, but essentially the way I understand it is the principle that a small change in the input of a system can produce wildly unstable output results. So the idea here is ultimately that small changes in either 1809 or 1993 can dramatically affect the situation on the other side of that historical continuum. So in this case, science and history come together. And then of course we've got Thomasina, who has this interest in has these interests in all kinds of sciences which are a century and a half ahead of her time, 2 centuries ahead of her time. So we've got this sort of sense of things like quantum mechanics, things like the fundamental symmetry of existence, things like the laws of thermodynamics, and so on and so on, all of which are shaping this play and are contributing to the erosion of certainty. Because the way that Stoppard sees things like chaos theory and quantum mechanics is that they destabilize traditional scientific discourses, traditional scientific meta-narratives. So rather than science producing certainty, science becomes a way of comprehending or coming to terms with the inherent uncertainty of the universe we live in. We might think of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which shows up, for instance, in Stoppard's play Hapgood. This idea that, for those of you who don't know Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it's the idea that if you know the trajectory of something's movement, you can never be sure of its position. And if you know the position, you can never be sure of its trajectory. So Stoppard is interested in these scientific discourses that open up spaces of not knowing, or open up impossibilities of knowing. And he's interested in the same thing with his historiography, this sense that rather than documenting an objectively existing past, by constructing histories, we create that past in a new form, or we reconfigure that past and create something new out of that. out of that process of writing history or deciphering history. So Stoppard is very much about this postmodern project of breaking down ways of knowing, breaking down large T truths, and ways of understanding the world via what we call ontological certainties, things that are held to be objectively true regardless of whether we know them, think them, agree with them, whatever it is. Stoppard is skeptical of these. He is instead a believer in what I call epistemological uncertainty, or compromised epistemologies, which would be ways of understanding the world, ways of looking at the world that are always limited by our own subjective positions, and that are always limited by the possibilities and the spheres of our knowledge. So we get this really with Thomasina, who's this fascinating genius mathematician, 13-year-old girl in 1809, who's just, like, her mind is working on a totally different level. And one of the points that Valentine makes when he's looking back and trying to decipher Thomasina's work is that the tools she had at hand in 1809, paper, pencils, were simply not sufficient. They were not fast enough, they were not complex enough to do the things that Thomasina's mind was capable of doing. Which of course raises issues about contemporary technology. And of course it throws into question our own sense of knowing our place in the world and knowing the possibilities of the world. Because if Thomasina was unable to, if Thomasina didn't have the technology to understand the world in the way that she could potentially have, what does that say about our own certainties of understanding the world? So this is Stoppard's sort of fundamental project, is let's take apart this sense that we know the universe, this sense that the universe is comprehensible and ordered in a way that is going to make sense to us. And instead, we need to somehow embrace this uncertainty, embrace this, embrace these compromised epistemologies.